Federal Drive is presented by GEHA, Government Employees Health Association, proudly providing health and dental benefits to federal employees and their families. Visit GEHA.com.
And now, the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton, sponsored by GEHA.
Welcome to the Federal Drive on Federal News Network. It's Thursday, April 30th. I'm your host, Terry Gerton, and I'm glad you're here. Coming up on this hour of the Federal Drive, extreme weather is forcing federal agencies to rethink who bears the risk when long-term cleanup work is overwhelmed. Plus, cutting contracts can promise quick savings, but it often shifts the cost onto services and the people who rely on them. Those stories and much more ahead during this hour of the Federal Drive. We begin with this. A new report is shedding light on how Department of Government Efficiency staffers gained access to sensitive Treasury Department payment systems last year. The Government Accountability Office found Treasury gave DOJ staffers access to data without following IT security rules. Privacy watchdog groups say GAO's report may be the tip of the iceberg on DOJ's access to sensitive government data. Federal News Network's Justin Doubleday joins me now with more details. Justin, thanks for being here.
Good to be with you, Terry.
All right, this is a new report from GAO. What does it reveal about DOJ's access to Treasury Department payment systems?
Well, GAO's report covers a somewhat short time period here, January and February 2025, the very start of the Trump administration when, as many folks will recall, DOJ was really doing this blitz across the federal government, starting in this case at Treasury, where they were seeking access to payment systems. And so GAO's report found that Treasury gave a DOJ staffer, an unnamed DOJ staffer, access to Bureau of Fiscal Service payment systems in at least three cases, three of those payment systems during that time period. The access allowed the staffer to view, copy, or print the data. But in one case, the staffer was inadvertently granted temporary access to create, modify, or delete data, which was not what they were necessarily seeking, but it did happen. GAO did not find any evidence of changes to the system data before the Bureau revoked that access. But what GAO's report found was that Treasury didn't follow its IT security rules for granting access to these really sensitive payment systems. For instance, they didn't ensure that a data loss prevention tool that is meant to kind of prevent Treasury payment data from going where it shouldn't, it didn't identify or prevent the sharing of USAID payment information by one of those DOJ staffers outside of Treasury's systems. And so that was one big issue here. And that was unencrypted payment information, so a big potential security hole. And then GAO found that Treasury didn't hold the DOJ employees accountable for not following IT security rules. They didn't, for instance, get written agreements to follow IT security rules before issuing them laptops and access. And so really this is about kind of following the IT security rules in the case of DOJ here, and how Treasury kind of jumped over some of those rules as DOJ was really seeking this sensitive data that was in the news last year.
What would DOJ have wanted to do with this data?
In this case, they were seeking access to USAID payments data in the early days of the Trump administration to essentially shut off payments to USAID, which they eventually did, of course, in dismantling that agency. And so this was part of really a quest to kind of target a specific agency, but of course that payments data that the Bureau of Fiscal Service handles goes across the entire federal government. The Bureau of Fiscal Service handles payments for the vast majority of federal entities. And so DOJ has also had interest in, fraud, waste, and abuse and nominally and things like that. And so, again, this is a somewhat limited report, and there may be more to come in terms of what else DOJ was kind of seeking to do or did do with access to these Treasury systems.
How is Treasury responding to GAO's findings?
Well, Treasury ultimately agreed with the GAO report's recommendations. GAO had a range of recommendations to define minimum screening requirements for people seeking access to payments data. Something else that GAO found Treasury didn't really have in place prior to these incidents. strengthening training before granting access to sensitive systems. We saw in this case, and I think in other cases as well with Doge, that agencies were found to have not really done the standard training before granting access to sensitive IT systems. And then in the case of tooling, GAO recommended the Bureau of Fiscal Service either update that tool that would have prevented unencrypted payment information from being sent outside of their kind of network boundary, or just update their process for reviewing any sort of messages that would send unencrypted payment information outside of the agency. So Treasury agreed with the recommendations, and we'll see what the follow-through is from here.
Justin, you mentioned that this might just be the tip of the iceberg as GAO conducts these kinds of investigations. Are you able to generalize about any big takeaways about how Doge and data privacy were interacting from this report?
Well, I went to some people who have been following this issue of Doge and data access very closely. And fair to say they are definite opponents of the Doge effort, but they've been following this from really the very beginning. You know, Quinn and X. Reese from the Center for Democracy and Technology really said that this is kind of just an unnerving report because it's written in GAO's typical kind of very, very bland style. No offense, GAO, but it's showing some pretty big ignoring of basic safeguards for this really sensitive data, and that could leave a range of people exposed to potential data errors or incorrect payment determinations, according to Quinn and X. Reese. John Davison from the Electronic Privacy Information Center, EPIC, pointed out the same. He said Treasury flouted basic security safeguards here. And, you know, he pointed out another section of the report where Treasury concluded that a Doge staffer with this kind of access could cause, quote, inestimable damage to security interests, yet they didn't get a signed access agreement from the employee or comply with some of those other safeguards that we spoke about. And so the takeaway for them was really that, you know, this showed how Treasury in this case, but potentially there could be others, just ignored safeguards that we kind of all take for granted and think happen automatically.
Well, speaking of the potential for others, what comes next with these ongoing reports and investigations?
Yeah, this is interesting. So GAO said that this is just the preliminary report on Doge's access to Treasury Department data, and there should be more to come there from GAO. GAO also released a report on Doge's access at the National Labor Relations Board. It ultimately found that the Doge team there did not use really any access that they were granted to the IT systems, but their report did not overlap with an ongoing investigation by the NLRB Inspector General into whistleblower allegations that a Doge representative compromised sensitive National Labor Relations Board data last March. And so that investigation is ongoing. There are several ongoing court cases involving Doge's access to data at the Social Security Administration, at the Office of Personnel Management, among others. And again, those are ongoing, and more could come out there. So I think we're kind of seeing the second shoe drop in terms of all of this, you know, consternation around Doge's access to data, some of the news stories and whistleblower reports that came out last year. Now you're seeing GAO reports come out a little bit more deliberative, a little bit more detail on some of these issues, IG investigations ongoing, court cases continuing to kind of slowly bring more things to light. And so there's still a lot more to come potentially on all of this this Doge business that we were all talking about so much last year and has kind of gone away a little bit in the national interest or the national conversation right now.
That's Federal News Network's Justin Doubleday. Justin, thanks for bringing us this story. It sounds like we will have to continue to pay attention.
Absolutely. Thank you, Terry.
You can find his full story at federalnewsnetwork.com. Up next, extreme weather is forcing federal agencies to rethink who bears the risk when long-term cleanup work is overwhelmed. This is The Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network.
Tune in Tuesdays at 10:30 a.m. and 2:30 p.m. for the Innovation in Government Show, sponsored by Carasoft. Hear from the industry leaders advancing the technologies shaping how agencies modernize secure operations and deliver better services. Innovation in Government covers what is changing now, what is working from cybersecurity and cloud to data, AI, and emerging technologies. Listen to Innovation in Government, Tuesdays at 10:30 a.m. and 2:30 p.m. on Federal News Network. Search Innovation in Government.
Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. As natural disasters grow more frequent and intense, new EPA Inspector General findings suggest some federal facilities Superfund cleanups may fail when conditions overwhelm existing remedies, pushing environmental and health risks into surrounding communities. We'll discuss what that means for EPA staff, partner agencies, and prevention planning before disasters strike with Erin Barnes-Weaver, Deputy Assistant Inspector General for Evaluation at the EPA Office of Inspector General. Erin, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
Before we dig into the report I really want to talk to you about today, I want to ask you just to refresh our collective memory about Superfund sites. What are they? Where are they located? Why are they important?
Yes, thank you. Superfund sites include both non-federal Superfund sites and federal facility Superfund sites. Non-federal sites are privately owned and tend to have industrial waste, where federal facility Superfund sites could be current or former military bases, radiological labs, defense research laboratories, and they can have a complex mix of contaminants like munitions, radiological waste, and other things. There are 157 federal facility Superfund sites across the country, which was the focus of our work, and they really are all over the country.
EPA Office of the Inspector General just released a report looking at the risks of those Superfund sites to exposure from natural disasters. And collectively, you found dozens of those sites at risk from sea level rise, inland flooding, or wildfire. Talk to us about what it would mean at one of those places if they were impacted by a natural disaster.
Certainly. So I'll note, too, that there are about 13 million people that live within 3 miles of one of these federal facility sites. 3 million people live within 1 mile. As I noted, they're all over the country. Some are in major population centers like Los Angeles and San Francisco and the Chesapeake Bay area. So a disaster at one of these sites can really harm these communities. I'll use wildfire as an example. If a wildfire were to hit one of these sites, it could release contaminants in the air through combustion, and that would harm the nearby community as well as downwind communities. And that's really what our report sought to highlight, which is a systemic risk to all of these sites from potential disasters. We're not saying these disasters are for sure going to happen or that there's an imminent threat or danger, but our reports show that these things could happen, and it's really important to take those risks into account and plan accordingly.
As you think about the kind of risk, sea level rise is a very different impact from a wildfire or from a flood or storm surge. And the geography is really different at all of these different sites. So how does that complexity and variability make planning for EPA much harder?
You're absolutely right. There is wide variability among these sites. There's just not a one-size-fits-all universal approach to the cleanup remedies at these sites. Some sites have been contaminated for decades, and these ongoing assessments that we talk about in our reports are really important to make sure that the remedies are still functioning as intended, that assumptions on exposure pathways and toxicity data are still valid, and whether any new information has come to light that could question the protectiveness of these remedies. Again, all of these sites are different. In addition to unique site conditions, the weather patterns near these sites are also quite unique, as you note. And so it's really important for these sites to take those unique factors into account through these 5-year reviews. And what we did was a very high-level national screening of all of the risks to all 157 federal facility sites. But again, it's really important for each of these sites to do its own individual screening based on its unique conditions.
You mentioned the remedy process, and it is unique for each site depending on what they're dealing with and their unique circumstances. But many of those remedy systems were designed decades ago. How well are they holding up under today's more frequent and intense disaster conditions?
You're right. I mean, some of these sites have been on the national priorities list for decades. And over those same decades, as you note, these extreme weather events are just increasing in their frequency and severity, which really does raise the risk level. But again, these 5-year reviews are opportunities to assess those risks and plan accordingly. Some sites are doing this and adjusting their remedies, and others may need to. I'm going to use inland flooding as an example. If a flood were to hit one of these Superfund sites, that could spread contamination to an area that might have already been cleaned up, which means that cleanup work has to be redone. So taxpayers are paying for multiple cleanups instead of just one. But if a site owner, through its 5-year review process, identifies an inland flooding risk, they can do things like raise or relocate infrastructure, install berms on the property that help direct the water flow, and take other resilience measures. And EPA actually has technical guidance on these and other resilience measures that these sites can consider as part of their 5-year review process.
I'm speaking with Erin Barnes-Weaver. She is Deputy Assistant Inspector General for Evaluation at the Environmental Protection Agency's Office of the Inspector General. These findings have big implications for federal employees who are responsible for overseeing these sites and for their partner organizations who may be contracted to support them. What challenges would you say they face as they're trying to balance their distribution of effort and resources between long-term remediation and acute disaster response?
Well, instead of really looking at long-term versus acute responses, we tried to focus on preparedness generally and whether these sites account for these disaster risks as part of their 5-year reviews. So our report series does show that there are risks from various natural disasters and that sites can use the 5-year review process as a proactive planning tool to assess these risks and put preparedness measures in place. I will note, though, on Superfund cleanups and hazardous waste cleanups, the topic of Superfund is a key part of our oversight portfolio, and we'll continue to monitor and evaluate those and other challenges.
These Superfund sites, especially because they're federally funded or under federal supervision, but responsibility spans EPA and other agencies. So how does the EPA collaborate across organizational boundaries? And did you find examples of where coordination and collaboration are working well?
Well, and the fact that these federal facility Superfund sites have so many stakeholders, that just adds to their complexity. We did not evaluate specifically the extent to which these federal partners are coordinating at each of these 157 federal facility sites. But the 5-year review process does give EPA and these other stakeholders some visibility into the unique concerns and conditions at those sites. Again, they're really valuable forward planning tools. And EPA has guidance that these 5-year reviews should note disaster risks, but our reports found that they aren't always incorporated.
You put these findings out using EPA's story map, and we've talked about that a couple of times on this show. I think it's fabulous. But why did you choose that mode? How are you hoping that changes the communication about the findings?
Well, as an Office of Inspector General, we're always looking for ways to innovate, and the story map just allows us to share our message with a wider audience and in a mobile format. And they, as you note, I think are just really cool. It's just a nice visual way to look at our findings. This was our second story map, and we did one last fall on air quality monitoring.
One of the other things that's interesting to me about this report is that it is a report without recommendations. Tell me first why you chose that approach, and second, what you hope EPA does now that they've got this assessment on their desk.
Well, yes. So your listeners who are familiar with our work may notice that these reports look very different from our traditional evaluation reports that have a recommendation section. And frankly, that was quite intentional. As we started doing our work on sea level rise, we noticed these risks and wanted to quickly get that message out on inland flooding and wildfires as well, especially ahead of wildfire season. There's been recent news reporting on how experts anticipate a very active wildfire season this summer. So we wanted to use a report structure that quickly conveyed our findings and highlight the risks to these sites. In terms of what we want EPA to do, we have provided EPA with the lists of sites that we think need to do a better job of assessing their disaster risks in their 5-year reviews, and the agency thanked us for that information.
Well, I thank you for the report and the discussion of it. It's a perfect time to tune our attention to these risks. I've been speaking with Erin Barnes-Weaver. She's Deputy Assistant Inspector General for Evaluation at the Environmental Protection Agency Office of the Inspector General. Thanks so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me and for highlighting our important work.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Listen to the Federal Drive on demand. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Still to come, for families with loved ones behind bars, missing information often means carrying risks they can't see or control. But first, one way that risk gets shifted. Cutting contracts can promise quick savings. The harder question is where the cost actually lands. You're listening to The Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Welcome back to The Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. A recent review of IRS contract cancellations found hundreds of millions of dollars in potential savings, but far less clarity about how those decisions shifted impact onto service delivery and workloads. The findings raise questions about how agencies assess who absorbs the risk when decisions are made quickly. I'm joined by LaToya George from the Treasury Inspector General for Tax Administration. Ms. George, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you.
The IG office there, TIGTA, has recently looked at contracts canceled by the IRS in 2025. Remind us, if you would, of the context of that. What was going on that you were looking at particularly?
So in January 2025, the president issued several executive orders asking for agencies to identify ways to save on funding, including canceling contracts. After that, the Department of Governmental Efficiency actually initiated a Defend the Spend initiative. This was something government-wide, and IRS participated. From that, the General Services Administration identified a list of contracts that the IRS could review. General Services Administration sent that list over to Treasury Department, and Treasury forwarded it to IRS. Their officials throughout the agency took a look at the contracts and identified which ones that they could either cancel in full, descope, meaning just cancel a portion of it, or whether they needed to keep them because it was very important to the IRS mission.
And as you looked at that set of contracts there at IRS, what were you trying to understand about the real effect of those decisions?
In our review, we wanted to identify the different types of contracts that were canceled, and specifically to see any that were going to be taxpayer forward facing, so really impact taxpayer services. So we took a look at just the different ones that could impact just customer service, for example, and that's what we focused on. That wasn't necessarily a focus during IRS's decision to cancel certain contracts, but it was part of our review so that we could let taxpayers know that there was any areas that may impact just the upcoming filing season, well, the filing season that has ended now.
Let's start at the high level and then work our way down then, because your report shows that IRS identified hundreds of millions of dollars in potential savings, but that the actual impact of those terminations was either limited or unknown. What's driving the gap between the savings headline and what's really happening on the ground?
So certain contracts are award types that do not necessarily carry an obligated value, and so it's not as easy to identify potentially the avoided costs or the cost savings and directly how it's going to impact the taxpayer on a daily basis. And so in our review, we looked to see if there were contracts that showed the specific avoided costs once it was canceled. So that would be any contract that maybe had the option to expand the contract by a few years, but by canceling it right now, then you cut off those additional years as well as the additional funds, as well as if there were funds that were obligated, but not necessarily something was delivered on. By canceling or descoping the contract right now, we could identify that those funds could be essentially returned back to IRS's pot of available funding.
And how did your assessment then of the actual savings of these canceled contracts line up with DOJ's headlines?
To be honest, we did not do a dollar for dollar comparison to DOJ's headlines. But in our review, we took those factors that I just mentioned of what we could identify an actual dollar amount for a cancel obligation or a cancel contract versus if you were to just take the total contract value and just say this contract was canceled and say that that was the amount saved, it wouldn't tell the full picture. So we wanted to dive deep and make sure that we're fully listing only the ones that funds could be saved. There are certain contracts, such as, I don't want to get it too much into the details of the contracting world, but something is called a blanket purchase agreement. And so for that one, it's essentially of having a charge card account with a high dollar limit. And you aren't necessarily spending the money, you just have that available funding there. And so if that contract is canceled, yes, that available funding is not there, but it wasn't necessarily saving dollars, if that makes sense. You just didn't get a chance to use any of those funds. So we did not include that in our analysis of funds saved because we couldn't say for sure that IRS would have ever even exercised the option to charge against that account, if that makes sense.
I appreciate that clarification. Latoya George is a director in taxpayer services and operational support in the Office of Audit at the Treasury Inspector General for Tax Administration. Let's now go back to that topic that you said was the focus. Within this set of hundreds of contracts, you were looking at taxpayer services. How did you identify which contracts were going to have an impact on taxpayer-facing services?
So we reviewed the contract requirements within the full contract details to identify those that were tied to taxpayer-facing operations. We assessed how the cancellations could affect those. For example, anything affecting IRS operations of processing returns, enforcing compliance, as well as just customer service interactions, whether that's on the phone or in person. Examples of those could be expert witness testifying. Those can benefit taxpayers as well as benefit the IRS. But we just identified different services or goods that would impact, like I said, day-to-day interaction for a taxpayer.
And what stood out to you about that specific collection of contracts and how they were canceled?
Well, nothing that we identified. For this review, it was truly informational just to identify the depth and span of contracts that were canceled. We did not look at the process the IRS took or the direct impact. That impact isn't really known yet. It may take a little while of IRS adjusting. They are going to use their current IRS employees to fill in the gaps from any support that was lost from the canceled contracts.
So you mentioned there that IRS is going to fill in some of the gaps created by these canceled contracts with current staff members. But we've heard a lot about how short the IRS is in staffing, how many people they lost over the course of 2025. Based on what you saw, would you think it's realistic, given current workload and staffing procedures, that the IRS would be able to fill those gaps created by the canceled contracts?
Honestly, it's too soon to tell, or at least for this review, we did not dive that deep. The actual impact on taxpayer services remains unknown currently, but I think that IRS is resilient. They have been resilient over the years, and they are internally adjusting where they can, getting their employees trained. We have several reviews that looks at the different ways that IRS is pivoting. There are some internal organizational changes, and so we will continue to review that and report to your listeners so that they could know as much as we find out.
Well, you did say that this report did not come with recommendations. It was an information-only report. But based on the information provided in this report, how should the IRS or perhaps even Congress be watching to see how these decisions play out over time?
Well, this filing season that just ended a week ago is going to surely tell some of the impact. That is usually the first indication of where you can see where IRS is in need of assistance from Congress, through funding, through additional support. So I would suggest for the listeners as well as Congress to just take a look at the impacts on the filing season and taxpayers in general.
Do you see that being part of the IRS's consideration in the future, where there are contracts that they're considering cancellation, thinking about how they do impact taxpayers?
I can't opine on that completely. I will say that they have drafted regulations and procedures. At the time of this effort for the Defend the Spend initiative, I can't say whether they did or did not include that in their consideration. Again, this was a little informational. We just wanted to get kind of the wide-eye view of what contracts were canceled and the potential impact. And we did not go in depth about their procedures, whether everything was tracked correctly. We do plan to look at something in the future, or we do plan to consider an audit related to the process for canceling the contracts, as well as making sure that all regulations were followed.
I've been speaking with LaToya George. She's a director in Taxpayer Services and Operational Support, Office of Audit at the Treasury Inspector General for Tax Administration. Thanks so much for sharing this report and your findings with us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts. Coming up next, for families with loved ones behind bars, missing information often means carrying risks they can't see or control. This is the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Families of incarcerated people depend on timely, accurate information to make decisions about safety, health, and contact. But when that information is missing, the risk shifts directly onto them. Those gaps raise a larger question about why transparency for prison families hasn't been treated as a core government responsibility. Here to share that impact is Heather Pirtle, president and founder of First Network. Heather, it is great to have you on the show. Thanks so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me. It's an honor.
Let's begin by having you tell us a little bit about First Network. What is your focus? Why did you start it?
First Network is actually surrounded by the story of my own personal journey. My husband was sentenced to federal custody within the Bureau of Prisons. And as a prison wife, I immediately started turning to the public for answers. And it was really hard to find answers. And so at that point, I decided to become a resource myself. And therefore, I founded and created First Network, which basically is just bringing a voice to the issues that are currently there. I have an IT project management background. And so therefore, I was very interested in reports, numbers, what's happening, creating solutions to whatever the problems were that were existing. And I didn't really see anybody right now out there in the federal prison environment that had any true focus on real-time statistics and data. Everything from what I was able to see was 3 to 5 years old by the time it was able to be surfaced and then addressed.
You recently wrote an article where you described being asked a simple but really kind of heavy question by someone with a loved one in a federal halfway house. What did that question reveal to you about how disconnected families often feel from what's really happening to their loved ones inside those facilities?
Right now, every time I get asked a question, whether they're in a halfway house or in a facility itself, it's hard to find any answers. Everything that is portrayed right now to the public is so far removed from what's truly happening on the inside and on the ground itself. So right now, there aren't any real solutions or answers to any of the questions. So everything is all speculative. No one's able to give any direction or any answers to any questions because everything changes from facility to facility. There's no real true process. And as far as the integration into the halfway house itself, there's a lot of things that could be done prior to them even being released and some missed opportunities with time within the system itself.
Tell me more about where that communication system breaks down. Where does the system most often fail to give people clear, reliable information about conditions and care?
I think that right now, because everyone hears about the short staffing that's going on right now within the federal prisons, I think that trickles down and affects everyone, the staff themselves, as well as the inmates, as well as the family members. Because there is no, if there is a policy, half the time people aren't educated to even know what the policy is. Therefore, how do you implement something that you don't even know exists? There isn't a clear plan or direction of how to implement that and then how to educate everyone. So there's no system in place right now to provide that visibility in order to be able to even address the issues.
There are some formal oversight tools in place, like there are ombudsman-style rules and reporting channels. Based on what you've seen in your experience, are those systems working or are they falling short, or is it some combination?
I don't know of any oversight things that are currently in place at the moment. I know that the federal oversight bill was passed. However, it's passed on paper. It's never been funded. And I think that would be a true tool that people would be able to utilize. However, without funding, it just sits there, like I said, on paper. And that's part of the reason why we were founded, because we actually took that bill and created and built the system. So we didn't need $65 million in order to fund something. We did it based off of just family members creating the system. So as far as oversight tools that are in place today, if they exist, we do not know about them. So they are now creating a BOP coordinator type program, which came after the program that we built, which was very similar to what we built. However, there is no transparency. So if that program exists, then we, the people, don't know about it or even know how to use it. So again, the education is falling short.
And is that ombudsman process working at all?
Internally for the BOP, from what I understand, and me personally, I have used it. You send an email to them and they refer you to the BOP website page as a resource to be able to look it up yourself, or they will give you the policy itself. But the policy is not being enforced. So the policy, again, is just on paper.
I'm speaking with Heather Pirtle. She's president and founder of First Network. Heather, you've talked about this kind of missing data, and you talk about the system you built. Tell us what kind of data you've been able to pull together and how you share that with family members.
What we did was we launched a beta test within our personal private group, where we listed every single one of the federal prisons and issues that they may encounter, whether it's prison conditions, commissary, food, security. And we actually would have our members go in and report issues that were happening in real time. We have access to the data because we have access to the people that are inside. It can be utilized by staff, by inmates, by family members. And we just report issues that are happening in real time in every single facility. We have a dashboard that you can roll out and you can look at in real time to address issues and be proactive. Instead of actually having to be reactive, wait for lawsuits, wait for issues to occur, you can address them right there in real time. So you could utilize the tool. We've already built it. We've already tested it. We did it for over a year. And you can track and trend whatever's happening right now.
What are you hearing from family members who've used your tool?
Well, we all know that the proof is in the data. And so in order to be able to present an argument, it's hard whenever you're just one person presenting your case. But whenever you have thousands of people being able to report on the same issue, it provides real-time analytics to be able to show and prove the story. I find that looking at graphs is much easier to instantly see issues. You can see spikes. You can see which prisons per se may be having issues. If there's a lockdown or something like that, it will instantly spike on a report. So then you're able to just recognize immediately where issues are happening and then start addressing them.
You mentioned earlier the challenge with staffing in the federal prisons and how short-staffed they are, which of course creates stress and challenges amongst the workforce there. As well, does your data point to any trends related to those staffing trends?
The staffing trends right now that we're noticing, the majority, the issues would be probably primarily in processing the paperwork. Because they're short-staffed, they're not able to conduct maybe the team meetings on time. They're not able to process paperwork. Even as far down as administrative remedies, the channel and being able to move those through the system. Whenever it's exchanging itself through multiple hands, it's hard to be able to do that whenever someone's on vacation or short staff, or a nurse is being pulled in to do paperwork, things like that. It just creates a backlog that affects the entire system. Now, I do feel like they are trying to address these issues. And I think that if they were able to utilize a platform similar to what we've already built, then you'd be able to start identifying the issues instead of relying on old forms of paper and being able to do it manually when you can do it digitally.
Have you had any interaction with Bureau of Prison leadership about the data and the trends and your network?
I did initially meet with the BOP support coordinators, and I had a few monthly meetings to show them the data that we captured during our beta test, and they seemed to receive it well and that it was helpful. I also did present this data to William Marshall himself and sent it to him via email, and he did respond and was receptive to at least looking at it and entertaining the idea. But I have not followed up with him to this point. So that's the only discussions that have been had.
What about with members of Congress? Obviously, there's a lot of interest there on the function of the prison system and how well it's organized and staffed. Any interest from the members of Congress?
We have actually been on the Hill and met with several different members of Congress, both House reps as well as senators, multiple times. We addressed the issues that are going on and how they voted 392 to 2 on the oversight bill. So we've tried to push their hands as far as being able to get this funded because they all agreed. So why are we not implementing it? But right now, they really haven't engaged. We've tried and we've gotten no feedback from them at all. We even went to the founders that wrote the bill itself, and still we're not able to get buy-in in order to be able to get it enforced.
Heather, you obviously have a personal connection and personal insight here with all of the data that you've collected, with the interaction that you have with other prison families across the country. What are the things that would really make a difference here in data, transparency, performance?
I think the biggest takeaway from all of this is, in order for a family member to feel like they're being heard, you hit it point blank. It's all about the transparency, being able to see, to know that they've been heard. If they're able to report an issue and see it or receive a response other than just a generic response, then it truly makes the person feel connected. And I think that we could all really work together to be able to solve the issues. I don't think it has to be an us against them or anyone like that. I look for ways to create win-wins. So how can we all work together? We all want the same solution, and that's to be able to bring our loved ones back home as soon as we can and to make them productive citizens in society.
Heather Purtle is president and founder of First Network. Heather, thanks so much for joining me today, for sharing your experience with us.
Thank you for having me.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts. The Army's newest AI project, ARIA, or the Rapid Implementation of Artificial Intelligence Initiative, is organized around 3 lines of effort that Army leaders say will ultimately merge into one. For more, Federal News Network's Anastasia Obis spoke with Deputy Undersecretary of the Army David Fitzgerald, who breaks down those efforts in part 2 of the conversation we began on Tuesday.
PPBE it's an extremely complicated process, and it just has a lot of interrelated, activities that kind of occur throughout the year across commands through different verticals within HQDA. And so we're taking other steps to kind of re-examine that process from top to bottom. But our approach here in ARIA was to seek or to identify the elements of the PPBE process that AI, we're most shovel ready for AI to come in and benefit and help posture us for future capability integration. So one of the big lessons was, our data, the state of our data. We still have a lot of disparate business systems that don't talk to each other, databases kind of all over the place, that low veracity because they're largely dependent on manual data entry. They're not really harmonized or easily joined. So we still, had a lot of work to do there to just kind of set conditions for AI to even come in and kind of ride on top and provide a solution. And so, we needed to move those databases around, collapse some business systems into a cloud-based environment that AI could actually access. And that resulted in a kind of peripheral benefit of sunsetting a number of legacy systems, which has already saved us, several $1 million, and we're retiring 33 more systems, converging another 12. And that consolidation is going to save close to $100 million in FY26 and about another $70 million in 27. So this is an exercise that's kind of like self-funding in many respects. And again, like I said, most of those databases are kind of siloed, and they reside in obsolete environments. And so one of the most challenging aspects of PPBE is accounting for the execution portion of that process. So then, we can look at the numbers, but they don't always explain why we made a decision. And so what this is ultimately going towards is a capability that, either G8 or, one of our kind of the vertical that really manages a lot of our resourcing decisions in how we program, but they can provide Army senior leaders with an ability to kind of run almost like a Monte Carlo sim in terms of querying, if we make this change on end strength, what are the second and third order effects that might have on munitions purchasing capability? Right now, that's all manually done. It takes a lot of people, a lot of time to come back with answers. And so, kind of one vignette of how this has already been utilized is we were able to look at, the Army activities and resourcing at one of our contingency locations in Africa to help inform basing decisions. And we did a comparison where we used the AI tool, and it was able to pull that information within a few minutes. By comparison, it took the same question about, we gave that, took 3 resource managers about 2 weeks to pull the same information, and the results were very similar. The AI was probably a little more accurate in the ultimate analysis. And so I think that was kind of like a real selling point to the enterprise to like, hey, these capabilities can actually help us move a lot quicker and have more effective decision-making process, speed and quality of decision-making. So that's, I think, where it's going to reside mostly right now. It's being developed, but that's kind of being fed in to our PPV process as we speak.
You also have Team Black developing a model armory. Could you talk about what exactly is a model armory and what are you trying to do there?
Yeah, so the model armory, it's intended to put AI at the tactical edge of our formations. You think of modern warfare, kind of the lessons that we're learning from watching, the use of drone systems in Ukraine. We anticipate that soldiers, as well as individual systems like small drones, like unmanned ground vehicles, are going to increasingly require AI models in the future. And currently, those are directly uploaded and embedded into soldier-operated systems and individual platforms, again, in a very kind of siloed manner. And changes or updates to those models have to be done manually at each node. And so the model armory, which is called a model armory because you can think of it as an arms room where you go and draw out the weapon that you need. This is going to provide soldiers a library of capabilities that they can request on demand, like computer vision models or a route analysis model, and then they can tailor it to the unique operational environment that they're going to be employed in. And so, for example, a user can request a computer vision model that's seeking specific, friendly or enemy vehicle signatures in a particular operating region with current weather conditions to get better results. And then that model continues to be hosted in that armory so other units can kind of use the best of breed and then tailor for their specific operational requirements. Another element is that the delivery pipeline to push those models to the edge in low power, low bandwidth environments. This is an on-demand capability that's going to allow soldiers and platforms the capability to quickly adopt that AI at the tactical edge. And then when they come back, like that model can then be uploaded and rehosted in the armory. So that's what we're really trying to solve is the employment and tailoring of AI models at the tactical edge.
Okay, great. Let's talk quickly about Team Yellowstone. So they're using AI to transform supply chain management. Could you talk a little bit about why Anniston Army Depot was selected as the first site for this pilot?
This is really also informed by, this isn't in a vacuum. This isn't kind of informed by and nested with parallel efforts to modernize our OIB operations and structure. But Anniston is where our M88 heavy recovery vehicles undergo depot level overhaul and maintenance. And, it's a lot of our OIB sites were built and constructed in 1942 and at the height of World War II, and they still look and operate very similarly to the way they did 80 years ago. And so there's a lot of inefficiencies and supply chain bottlenecks that exist there. Records are still largely kept on Excel spreadsheets. They're not connected to outside systems. So we can't really get into the specifics of the platforms due to the operational sensitivity, but we have a lot of parts that are on back order. We kind of, go off historical trends rather than like what we should know that we need in a particular moment. And so we targeted that one to begin the digital twin process. But overall, we're looking to improve those efficiencies on all of the overhaul lines, but then looking to, kind of scale that into other areas to streamline operations across the OIB. I think one of the most important steps, that's part of this process is to capture and maintain the data to provide a data foundation that AI can come in and help drive decisions on top of. And that includes mapping, optimizing the supply chain, and incorporating advanced manufacturing across many of our OIB sites. And so altogether, that's going to give Anniston the capability to make informed kind of make or buy decisions, meaning like, do we make this part? Do we go out and buy it? And that will drastically bring down long lead times for our critical repair parts and kind of starting to set the foundation so that we can bring these AI capabilities across our repair and manufacturing OIB sites.
What's the current vehicle downtime, and by how much does the Army want to improve that number?
I think, generally, like a good example that Sec Army talks about publicly a lot is we have our 777 heavy artillery systems. Like we went out to Campbell where the 101st is based. and every one of the 777s was down for a very, very small repair part that we could actually like 3D print for fractions of what it would cost to get that same repair part from a manufacturer. But like, because we don't have the kind of ability to see in real time, like what those repair parts are, and this also dovetails with like the need for right to repair and having the technical data to produce that part. If we could 3D print that part, we would be able to get these things back online within days. And instead they're sitting waiting for repair parts for 9 months to a year. So that's an easy example that Sec Army often mentions, but to kind of illustrate the point. So, but you can kind of imagine that same problem sort of existing at scale across our more exquisite systems.
One more thing I was wondering about is, how did the shutdown and CRs impact the effort overall?
Great question. So that was one of our biggest delays in kind of getting these things up on the rails, was the resourcing. I mean, this sort of underscores like why it's so hard to kind of shift approach midstream, and why the PPBE process is so central to our in changing the way we approach that is so central to our ability to modernize in a number of other areas. But yeah, because we were sort of mid-year, even though this was a great idea and the industry was willing and ready to go, because we were under CR, we can't do new starts. And so we had to figure out like what existing contract vehicles did we have? How could we move money around? And so even though, we had the lines of effort scoped out, industry was ready to go by the end of the calendar year. In some cases, the money is just now like getting where it needs to be. Fortunately, because of the good relationship that we have with industry, like some of them were able to kind of start work already, but that is a great example of resourcing and CRs continue to be an impediment to our ability to move quickly. The good news is we, have resourced proactively a sizable wedge in the next fiscal year, so that like as we continue to scale this effort, we're not going to run into a similar challenge, because like we'll have the money already resourced. It's just by virtue of the fact that we were under a CR for almost all of last year, we kind of had to wait until the end of the fiscal year to really be able to move the money and do reprogramming actions. So CRs are and continue to be a huge impediment to our ability to deliver capability to warfighters quickly.
Deputy Undersecretary of the Army David Fitzgerald, speaking there with Federal News Network's Anastasia Obis. You can find her full story at federalnewsnetwork.com. The Federal Drive with Terry Gerton is produced by Eric White and Michelle Sandiford. Our web editor is Stephanie Wright. For the latest updates, stay with federalnewsnetwork.com or follow us on Facebook, YouTube, and LinkedIn. I'm Terry Gerton. Thanks for listening.